Hello and welcome to this GCC recording as an introduction to Robert Louis Stevenson.
What is this feeling of power and drive I've never known? I feel alive. Where does this feeling of power derive, making me know why I'm alive? Like the night, it's a secret, sinister, dark, and unknown. I do not know what I seek, yet I'll seek it alone. I have a thirst that I cannot deprive. Never have I felt so alive. There is no battle I couldn't survive. Feeling like this, feeling alive. Like the moon, an enigma, lost and alone in the night. Damned by some heavenly stigma, but blazing with light. It's the feeling of being alive, filled with evil but truly alive. It's the truth that cannot be denied. It's the feeling of being Edward Hyde. Wait, what's this? Sweet miss, I thought I had lost you.
This then is a guide to Jekyll and Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Quick user's guide on the screen there. Give it a quick skim through to see how best to use this video. The marking criteria, as you can see, AO1, AO2 and AO3. Today's PowerPoint is mostly going to be focusing on AO3 for context, understanding how the book links to the time it was written and the way the audience engage with it. Stevenson writes about all these themes then, and we're going to look at how his life links to some of the ideas listed on the screen. What do we need to know about Robert Louis Stevenson? He was the man that wrote the book. It is because of his life and background that Jekyll and Hyde was written the way it was. Stevenson was born in Edinburgh in 1850. He grew up at home and was brought up by his nurse, who loved telling young Stevenson tales. His nanny noted that Stevenson had vivid imagination. This was exaggerated by his medical illness of bronchitis and was diagnosed with tuberculosis or TB. This meant he was bedridden and not allowed out of the house. She entertained him for around 20 years with stories based on her Calvinist beliefs. Well, what are Calvinist beliefs? Well, Calvinism is the idea that humankind is depraved or deformed or corrupted from what God intended. Calvinists believe in predestination. That means that God has knowledge of the future and what will happen. You cannot escape then God's destiny. Stephen suffered from insomnia and dreams. His father then settled him to sleep with imaginary stories and conversations. This fueled his imagination and led him into writing from the age of 6. He began to imagine himself in two forms, myself and the other fellow. But Stevenson saw this as a result of his fevers. Stevenson saw himself as myself, a rational, sane human being. But he also saw part of himself as the other fellow, as the side that held the darkness and imagination. To Stevenson, this was really exciting. Here's a poem from him then, about him describing perhaps this other fellow inside him, referencing his shadow. Stevenson's Edinburgh was a maze of streets and alleyways. Although he set Jekyll and Hyde in London, some of the descriptions clearly linked to his experiences in Edinburgh. Edinburgh was a maze of a city, a place where it's easy to get lost down a dark alley.
Stevenson was raised in Edinburgh, Scotland, shaping his masterpiece in two ways. First, Edinburgh is composed of two sections, Old Town and New Town. New Town is elegant and organized. Old Town has narrow streets and hidden doorways. Some critics suggest the novella is actually based in Edinburgh rather than London. Second is the figure of William Brody, a professional cabinet maker from Edinburgh's Old Town who was found to use his skills at night in order to rob the homes of the rich and respectable.
So who was this William Deacon Brody? Born 1741, died 1788. William Deacon Brody was a gentleman and a cabinet maker by day, but a housebreaker and sex addict by night. R.L. Stevenson was told tales about Brody by his nurse, and soon became captivated by the story of this seemingly respectable man who spent his nights stealing, gambling and robbing banks. Stevenson went to university and even began dressing as Brody, dabbling in some of Brody's old habits and going to the same places the infamous criminal went over 100 years before.
But the story was more than dark fable. Stevenson based it on the exploits of a man who actually lived here in Edinburgh in the 18th century. His name, William Brody, a builder and cabinet maker by trade. Nicknamed the Deacon, Brody was considered one of Edinburgh's most reputable businessmen. A hard-working, impeccable craftsman, he was head of the Masons Guild and a member of the city council. Above all, however, Brody was a pillar of respectability. But as night fell, Brody, like Stevenson's fictional Mr. Hyde, assumed a far more unsavory identity. One that felt at home in the sleazy sections of town. Here, Brodie, with other members of his gang, planned a series of daring robberies that baffled the good citizens of Edinburgh. Not content with the dark clothing usually favored by cat burglars, William Brody audaciously flaunted himself in white. For years, Brodie and his gang of thieves burglarized at will the stately mansions of Edinburgh's elite. Then, one night, the Deacon's luck ran out. A robbery he planned was foiled at the last moment. After that, no more doors opened for the wily William Brody. He was eventually arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. This man, who was a gentleman by day and a thief by night, was hanged about 100 yards from here. In a way, he died by his own hand. The gallows that once stood there were built by Edinburgh's master craftsman, William Brody. A century later, Robert Louis Stevenson modeled his most famous literary creation on the lurid adventures of this former solid citizen. His inspiration may have come much earlier, for Stevenson's childhood toys were once kept in an oak chest like this one, carved by a man who was both a master craftsman and a master criminal, a certain Mr. William Brody, believe it or not.
A young and willing Stevenson would have been to places filled with gin and opium, the drink and drug of choice in Victorian society. Both of these drugs produce a hallucinogenic effect. They make you see things, so the drug addicts and gin drinkers would have changed respectable men into monsters. Some of the signs then of opiate abuse or opium abuse are listed on the board. You could easily link those to how Hyde seems to behave. He can't stand still. He seems to be constantly distracted. He's restless. He has rapid mood swings out of nowhere. He also seems to move around a lot and have dilated pupils, perhaps linking to the idea of him being animalistic in the book. Stevenson had another kind of duality about himself. On one side, he was frail and weighed only 123 pounds at 23 years old. On the other side was a man who was amazing to talk to, with the imagination of a child and the writing skill of one of the greatest authors who ever lived. This meant he had often had friendships with men more flamboyant and masculine than himself. From the outside, these would be unlikely friendships. For much of his life, Stevenson was bedridden due to his condition, regularly on various drugs to stabilise him, so he'd be familiar with the hallucinogenic effects of drugs and the after effects of withdrawal. In later life, he also used drugs to feel alive. Stevenson had vivid dreams, and one of these was his inspiration for Jekyll and Hyde. His wife, Fanny Osborne, recalled that he wrote 60,000 words of Jekyll and Hyde in 6 days whilst on cocaine.
Good and evil are so close as to be chained together in the soul. Man is not truly one, but two. Now, supposing we could break that chain, separate those two selves, free the good in man and let it go on to its higher destiny, and segregate the bad. Let it destroy itself in its own degradation.
Good heavens.
Why, Dr. Jekyll?
Hopelessly insane. This is pure balderdash.
You're dealing with things it would be better not to mention for your own sake. There might be trouble.
In later life, Stevenson moved away from his home and began travelling the world. R.L. Stevenson moved around a lot in later life against his doctor's better judgment. He moved to Bournemouth with his wife, and Treasure Island was written based on his adventures abroad, and Jekyll and Hyde was written in 1886. Of course, Treasure Island became the inspiration for Pirates of the Caribbean. In 1889, he began to travel and stayed a while in Samoa and finally settled there. Samoa is just a little bit north of New Zealand. This would also be his last home. He died in 1894 at the age of 44. What do we need to know about R.L. Stevenson? He was a brilliant writer who excelled at writing about the best and worst of the human condition, due to his experiments and upbringing. He was the 19th century version of Roald Dahl, a man who exaggerated the best and worst in the human condition.